Maria, how many registrations do we have?
We have more than 420, but we are already live. So,
okay.
Yeah.
We don't move too quickly to another place.
Well, it won't be quickly.
A couple of years before we move.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aline Hofman. I don't know if you could see me.
I think that's a good, because if not, it would be
we
much
need
more.
also only to see the financial. Sorry.
Maria, am I starting? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Yes? Good afternoon. My name is Aline Hofman. Welcome to this year's launch of the benchmarking. Everything's different this year. We're doing the launch of the benchmarking Working Europe in the autumn and not in the spring. And most obviously, we're doing it online rather than in the lovely rooms of the Austrian Trade Union Federation, ÖGB, in Brussels. The good part of this is that we have over 400 registrations, and that's much more than would ever fit into the ÖGB's room. So for that, it's one of the good parts about this digitalization we've all been thrust into, is that we can certainly reach more people. We have a full program for you this afternoon. We can only give you just a taste of what we have in this year's benchmarking Work in Europe. We have some guests that we're going to discuss it with, and I will be walking you through that program. Just a word on interpretation. We have German and English interpretation. To find the interpretation, if you move your mouse on the screen, you should see on the bottom right-hand corner an icon of a globe and the word interpretation. You can choose your language there, English or German. One note, just in case some of you have older versions of Zoom, we would ask those of you, when you speak, when you take the floor, to please make sure to use the language channel that you're going to be speaking in. So even if you've been listening in English, for example, if you're speaking German, please use the German channel. There are some technical issues with older versions of Zoom that mix up the languages then. We don't want that. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor to Luca Vicentini, who will officially open today's event. Luca, you have the floor.
Thank you, Aline, and thank you everybody for connecting for this semi-virtual event. I say semi because, as you can, effect of force of social distancing. Technical problem. Sorry, the double sound in this room. So, as I say, yeah, we are in total and full respect. Yeah, now it works. Sorry for this little technical inconvenience, but as you can understand, no, there is still a... Let's see. We try again. Fantastic. Now, apparently it works. Fingers crossed. So, welcome everybody again for this launch of the ETUI benchmarking for this year. As I said, is a semi-virtual meeting, virtual for all of you, except the three of us, myself, Philippe Pochet, and Nicolas, that are sitting in the same room together with me, representing the ETUI and the ETUC to this launch. We are, as I said, in full respect of social distancing in this room. And yeah, thank you also, Aline, for introducing and opening the meeting. You will see we will have a very dense agenda with a lot of topics for discussions that of course are linked to the different issues that have been addressed by the ETUI benchmarking this year. Is a very rich paper for those of you that had the possibility to have a first look at the almost 200 pages of analysis that are contained in the paper. And I'm absolutely convinced from on behalf of the European Union Confederation that this paper is really going to provide us with a lot of very good background of analysis, but also of ideas and proposals on how to tackle the challenges that we have in front of us, and also on how to pave the path for a sustainable recovery, for making sure that we can manage this horrible crisis we are facing properly, and also we can really create the conditions to getting out of this crisis, out of the pandemic, by protecting people, protecting workers, protecting the societies in which we are living, and also being able to restart a sustainable economic growth, possibly, and this is really the biggest challenge, possibly building a different model for recovery and growth, because the one that we have faced so far, before with the austerity measures, and then with a mainly jobless growth with a lot of rising inequalities, was not exactly the type of growth and the type of recovery that we wanted. Now we have the opportunity in this disgrace in which we are, but we still have the opportunity to build a different future, a future that is more inclusive. Everybody is left behind, and where we can really go towards a greener, more digital, but also more socially fair future for everybody in Europe, in our continent, for workers, for businesses, and for the whole society. In this respect, of course, the ETUC needs the background of this benchmarking, because all the elements that are analyzed in there really provide us with some inspiration, but also with very concrete tools on how to set up our policy for the future, making sure that for next year in particular, we will have really everything on the right track to go in the right direction. This will be also a fundamental tool, the benchmarking, not only to shape our policy, but also to make trade union action stronger, more ambitious, and also, this is also very important, to have a proper influence and impact on the general public discourse, on the different discussions we are having with the European and national institutions, with our counterpart, the employers organizations, how to influence the narrative, how to change the mistakes that have been done in the past, and how to build a more sustainable and more progressive narrative is also a fundamental element if we want to influence the policy. And to influence the narrative and to change the narrative, we need very fact-based analysis that can really make our policy more vocal and more heard by everybody. In this respect, as you will see in our agenda today, we have also important institutional interlocutors that will discuss together with us on how these facts and analysis that have been provided through this benchmark can be used also by institutions and decision makers to give the right input to their own policies. The last thing I want to say is that I want really to thank the ETUI, the Director General Philippe Pochet, the Director for Research that was in charge of putting together all this incredible work, Nicola Contouris, with all, of course, the research department of the Institute that has contributed with the inputs of the different people, and also the communication department to set up this very impressive work and this very important and positive result that is the benchmark 2020. Thank you very much, and I think someone else will follow. Thank you, and have a very good presentation and meeting.
Thank you, Luca, for this nice word. And I'm very pleased to present you the 20th anniversary version of of the benchmarking. And I think it's that we started benchmarking in 2000, and the idea at that time is to challenge what the employers were producing, UNICEF at the time, now Business Europe, and to put it in the debate, in the public debate, a version which is different from the view of the employers. And what is interesting is that we are using more or less the same data, but the interpretation of the data, the mix of the data is rather different. And then I think that from the first version of the benchmark, there were different development, and this one is particularly interesting. It's new also in the way of presenting some graph and the narrative that is developed along this presentation. This benchmarking was affected as all the activities were affected by COVID-19, and it's the center of this publication. I would like to thank also ETUC for this collaboration, but we are working always together, so it's nothing new. But for a few years, we are doing the launch of the debate, of the benchmarking with UGB and Arbeiterkammer, AK, and we had the chance to do that as was said by Aline in their nice setting. This year we inaugurate our lab, Edu Lab, and it's the first hybrid meeting that we organize here. But we found it's important to continue to work with them, to present with them, and Oliver will follow me. What I would like also to say is in the benchmarking you have a lot of graph, and if we can put the one graph I select each time on the screen. Each time I follow one graph which should appear on the screen. It's on the screen, even I don't see that here. The graph on the screen is the investment in clean energy. And the investment in clean energy, I think, is really important because we have now in.
But you need to click share.
That we are confronted with will be the climate crisis, and this one will not stop with a vaccine. This one will continue. This one has to be tackled seriously, and then it's important to see where EU is on that. And if you look to the graph, at the beginning, EU was really leading, and at one point, China overcome EU, and for 2 years, in 15 and 17, China invests more in clean energy than US and Europe together. And I think that's rather challenging and important to think what it implies for the future. Last year, Europe did some progress, and that's good, but not enough. And again, US and China have invested more than Europe. Know that we have the Green Deal, and the Commission have issued the Climate Pact this Wednesday. There is a huge ambition for Europe, and that is tackled also in the benchmarking. As Luca said, it's time now to think about a different model, and a model that take into consideration the limit of the planet. Finally, I would say thank you, really thank you to all the team at the ETUI who work hard in difficult circumstances to put that together, to have a meaningful publication. A lot of information. It's not only 200 pages, but it's very dense and also very clear. I would like to thank in particular our colleague Romek, who was the coordinator with Nicola for this version. And with that, I stop and give the floor to Oliver. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Aline, Philip, and Luca, and also from my side, wish you all a nice afternoon, and I would like to join you in welcoming all the participants to this launch of the Benchmark Working Europe 2020. I am really happy that ÖGB and AK are once again the co-organizers of this event, even if unfortunately we can't host you at our premises. I hope that next year this will be possible again. But we are really proud that we supported this event for many years together with ETUI and ETUC. Today, you said it, I'm wearing a double hat on behalf of ÖGB and the ESC Workers Group. And I can assure you that the benchmarking report is always a very, very important and estimated input for us as a workers group and for our work here in the ESC. And I'm sure that we will also organize some activities here in the framework of the ESC in order to discuss the main findings of this benchmarking report. I think it's not exaggerated to say that the benchmarking has become a key resource for trade unionists across Europe, and we are very proud that this is now marking its 20-year anniversary. Congratulations to everyone at ETUI and ETUC who has been involved in producing the benchmarking this year and also over the last 19 years, and who have all contributed to achieving this significant landmark. I'm just hearing some voices. I think Philip has still his micro open.
You never know.
Okay, I continue. Anyway,
The computer.
Philip, can you
Just the computer.
Can you mute your micro, Philippe Pochet? I always hear your voice. Sorry. Thanks a lot. Okay, as trade unions, we already have many of the policy responses, and they may need fine-tuning or adjustments, but we know what is needed also in times of crisis. It's decent jobs with fair wages and working conditions, supporting by collective bargaining, social dialogue and democracy at work. Quality and accessible public services for all, supported by public investment, productive private investment, progressive and fair taxation, which ensures that those with the largest pockets pay their fair share. And I think, I hope that we all agree that the full implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights remains a key priority for us as trade unions. And despite the initial doubts some of us had, included myself, I think we can see now that this pillar has indeed played an important role in putting the social dimension back on the European political agenda. The progress was slow, but there has been some progress. And I hope very much that this is now the time to get this pillar implemented and to draw up really an ambitious action plan on the implementation of the social pillar. I'm convinced that the social pillar must be at the center on any recovery strategy, and the economic and social recovery must be at the same level. I would like to mention just quickly, just 2 points, because I think we all saw today the figures that we have alarming growing in-work poverty across Europe. I saw this and I think it's really alarming. And one of the replies is, of course, the initiative for fair minimum wages in Europe on the one hand, but I think we have also to strengthen the social protection systems across Europe, because we can see that some of them are not appropriate in order to prevent and avoid poverty. And therefore, I just wanted to mention the idea of having also minimum standards for the unemployment systems, for the national unemployment systems in the member states, in order to have at least minimum standards for the net replacement rates and for the duration periods and for active labor market policy to reintegrate people in the labor market. I think this is important. This is somehow already in the pillar, and I think it should be reflected also in the action plan. And the second point I wanted to mention, because it's also in chapter 6 in the benchmarking, and this is the question of democracy at work. I think in times of the Green Deal, just transition, digital transition, everyone says that it is important that all the stakeholders are on board, including, of course, the workers and the social partners. And we had a lot of discussions just last week and the week before with Franz Timmermans, with Margarete Vestager, and all of them, they assured us it is important that all of them are on board in order to make this transition really a success. But I think the current framework, the existing framework, is not fit for purpose. Therefore, we are really asking for a new legal framework and for upgrading the existing framework for democracy at work, so for information, consultation, and participation rights of workers. And I have here a look also to Nicola Schmidt. Nicola, I hope very much that there will be at least a reference in the action plan on this important point, because I think this is really key to make the Green Deal and the digitalization a success. So I will stop here. Dear colleagues, despite the many challenges we face, I think the benchmarking 2020 also offers us some cautious hope that going forward we can capitalize on this crisis to bring about a stronger social Europe that can deliver a decent future for all. I very much look forward to the discussions and already take the opportunity to wish you all a safe and peaceful Christmas and all the very best for 2021. Thanks a lot.
Maria.
Thank you very much to Oliver, to Philippe, and to Luca for those words. I'd now like to give the floor to Nicola Contoulis, Director of the Research Department. And Nicola will attempt the very difficult, which is to give us at least a flavor of all that's in the benchmarking in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nicola.
Very much.
Why is it this?
Europe. This is an important landmark for us all, and a tribute to the relevance and incisiveness of a project that, as Director Pochet has already noted, began 2 decades ago under very different circumstances, but remains extremely relevant. The reason benchmarking has a loyal following and a growing audience is that it provides a clear and accessible, but also evidence-based assessment of the state of health of social Europe on a yearly basis. This year's issue is no exception, and although I could not make justice of the outstanding work performed by our colleagues and researchers, I hope you will allow me to do exactly what Aline just suggested, just give a flavor, an overview of this year's issue, and then to highlight in particular 2 main findings that I think can help us garner a novel understanding of the challenges triggered by this pandemic in 3 distinct temporal phases: the early phase of the pandemic, the current phase, but also in the next post-pandemic period that inevitably will be affected by the policy decisions that Europe takes now and in the coming weeks and months. Let me begin by offering an overview, a short overview of this year's anniversary issue. It will be brief because several other colleagues that actually authored some of these chapters will be presenting on them later. The first chapter offers one of the clearer snapshots of the impact of the pandemic on the economic and macroeconomic fundamentals, in particular, of Europe. The key theme emerging here is that the impact of the pandemic of member states on particular sectors and groups has varied considerably and risks both aggravating pre-existing imbalances as well as creating new ones. This chapter, as is clear at this stage, acknowledges that the response that the EU has given to this crisis varies even substantially from previous responses to previous crises. But some open questions remain, and my colleague Sotiria will elaborate on them later on. The second chapter is no less insightful when it comes to the assessment of the economic shock triggered by the pandemic and of its consequences on labour markets. I'll be brief here, as I will elaborate further on one important aspect raised in this chapter, in a couple of minutes. Clearly, the impact of the pandemic have both affected adversely pre-existing inequalities present in our labour markets, but also generated new ones. Women, the young, ethnic minority workers, but also precarious workers have been affected in a disproportionate manner by this pandemic and its effects on the labour market. Some workers have been able to telework, while others have not. And this is a new bifurcation and element of inequality in the labour markets that will continue to generate its own challenges and inequalities in the years to come. Chapter 3 makes a very clear point, as Director Pochet has already set out. If you think that the challenges posed by the COVID lockdowns have been momentous and even terrible on their own, then rest assured that unless we deal with climate change now, further down the line we will encounter challenges that a climate challenge that we're all confronted with. Please watch this space, as the impact of climate change and the green recovery on the world of work would be one of our top priorities here at ETUI in the years to come. Chapter 4 makes a very strong case for the post-COVID recovery to be based on the redistributive role of adequate minimum wages and collective bargaining, as Director Vicentini has already pointed out. We know that much of Europe's austerity decade has both generated new and often grotesque levels of inequality, but also exacerbated pre-existing ones. And clearly the impact of the pandemic has done the same. But we need a way out of the present crisis, and one that is based on a fair income and fair distribution of the resources that still exist in our economic system, except as a consequence of the pandemic, have been distributed in the most unequal way ever seen in recent years. Chapter 5 is a new entry in benchmarking work in Europe, as this is the first time that our colleagues from the Health and Safety Unit, one of the strongest units within the ETUI, have contributed a chapter on their own. It is fair to say that an issue of benchmarking dealing with COVID that did not discuss the OSH angles of the pandemic would have been like staging a performance of their Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. Through this chapter, you will see that the many challenges that we are facing now, from PPE shortages to weak, often inadequate health and safety procedures in the workplace, including in a new distance workplace, are also the legacy of the past, or rather the legacy of a rather cavalier attitude towards the preventing obligations, an element that have always been present in OSH legislation. Chapter 6 offers the clearest overview of the pressures that the pandemic has placed on democratic decision-making in the workplace. And surprisingly, it also highlights the link between the inadequate levels of worker participation at the company level, for instance, within health and safety processes, and the dramatic effects of the pandemic in the world of work and beyond, while also demonstrating the strong correlations between a stakeholder-based corporate governance model and fair wages and fair redistributions of resources and wealth. A point that the ETUI and ETUC see as a key element for Europe to emerge from the current crisis stronger and more cohesive than ever. Our final chapter 7 is also a new entry. It is a foresight chapter that offers to our readers an opportunity to develop a number of possible post-pandemic scenarios and understand their potential impact on the world of work and social Europe at large. I will say something about this in a minute. Let me just share with you a couple of very informative slides that you can find in this issue of benchmarking work in Europe. The first one offers some data about the early impact of the pandemic on labor markets, especially in terms of the short work and other furlough or income replacement schemes deployed in all European member states. Now, of course, the pandemic very much worsened our unemployment statistics just at the time that they were recovering from the previous crisis. And the number of unemployed persons increased by more than 1 million between January and July 2020. But Chapter 2 suggests this is not the figure, or not the only figure, that we should be focusing our attention on. In the early months of the pandemic, we had more than 50 million workers in the EU +1 on some sort of short-time work or similar job retention schemes, while the number of economically inactive persons rose by nearly 4.5 million on a year-on-year basis. The income replacement arrangements for workers affected by those term or furlough schemes, short-term work or furlough scheme, also varied dramatically from country to country. So this is to illustrate that this is really not an equal opportunities pandemic. Its impact very, very different and partly masked by public intervention, but with unequal consequences already emerging now and potentially becoming more exacerbated in the months and years to come. We are left, however, with a much more complex reality than the traditional binary position in a labor market where somebody is either employed or unemployed and with few being inactive. The legacy of this pandemic is and will be that we'll have a growth, of course, of the inactive population. And we currently have a large number of workers that are not technically in employment, but do receive some income replacement without being technically unemployed either, but whose future work prospects and income security are extremely uncertain. The second figure that I would like to bring to your attention and briefly discuss pertains to the impact that the pandemic and some of the measures that I've just discussed have had on the public finances of European member states and Europe as a whole. It is clear that these schemes and the general level of public expenditure to cope with the effects of the pandemic have had an important impact on our public finances and the level of public debt in particular as a percentage of wealth, GDP. You can see from this graph that it's clear now that the 60% fiscal limit on public debt envisaged by the currently suspended Growth and Stability Pact is quite simply no longer attainable by a majority of EU member states. And we suspect that this figure will only become more evident and important in the months and years to come. This fact and the consideration that more public money will have to be spent in the future, and not just to deal with the consequences of the pandemic, clearly begs the question whether the macroeconomic constitutional framework of the EU and the Growth and Stability Pact in particular are serviceable, or will require more structural rethinking in the years to come. Also considering the substantial amounts of public expenditure needed in order to embrace the challenges of climate change, a point elucidated further in Chapter 3 that Director Pochet already made a reference to. It's really hard to see whether we should continue to aspire in any way to the traditional fiscal rigor that we've imposed upon ourselves in recent decades, and whether that rigor is sustainable at all. If we were to aspire and to continue with those measures and that degree of fiscal rigor, then deep and searching questions would inevitably present themselves. How can we achieve these fiscal targets? Will we need a new wave of austerity and more cuts to public spending? Should we perhaps think about fairer taxation or some sorts of form of debt restructuring? These are searching questions, but our issue of benchmarking, and in particular the more detailed analysis carried out in Chapter 7, clearly suggests that these are essential questions, in fact, vitally important ones for the future of social Europe and of the European project as a whole. What I know for sure, and I will pause here, is that the future issues of benchmarking work in Europe will be there to help us grapple with these questions and to provide evidence-based answers that ensure the sustainability of our European social model and make good on the promise, which is enshrined in Article 3 of the Treaty of the European Union, for a social market economy aiming at full employment and social progress, and, I note, a high level of protection and improvement of the quality of the environment. Thank you for your attention, not just for this presentation, but also for the work of the ETUI and ETUC as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I think you've certainly managed to give us a very good impression of what is in the benchmarking, which you can at least see online, and there will be print versions available soon. So thank you for that. Now we'd like to take the chance to discuss some of the themes that we've heard from our introductory speakers today and that Nicola has pointed out from the report. We have joining us on the panel that I'd like to introduce. We have Nicola Schmidt, Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights at the European Commission. I don't think you need much more introduction than that. Welcome to the panel. Thank you for coming. Then from the European Parliament, we have Agnes Jongerius, who is an MEP for the Social and Democrat group, who is also here. Let me see if I can see her. She is. Yes, there she is. Welcome, Agnes. Lovely to have you. Dennis Radke, who is an MEP for the EPP group. He is here as well. Hello, Dennis. Herzlich willkommen. And we have Ana Catarina Mendoza Mendes, who is the president of the parliamentary group of the Portuguese Socialist Party, here in a way and invited to help us sort of look ahead to the next presidency, which will be held by the Portuguese government. So Ana, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about what your government may or may not be able to do. We don't have a lot of time, and we decided it would make the most sense, given the breadth of issues confronting us today, to try and dip into a number of different topics. So I'll be asking each of the panelists a few questions, give us a short answer so that we can move along and try and cover as much ground as we can. So my first question goes to Nicola Schmidt. Clearly, the key question raised by this year's Benchmarking Work in Europe report is, will the EU level response be different compared to the previous crises that we had, where we initially threw money into the system and then turned back to harsh adjustment policies in the labor market and in the social domain? So Nicola Schmidt, tell us, will this, is this time going to be any different? And if so, how? How do we get out of this mess?
Yeah, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this panel, and I really congratulate also the authors of ETUI for this document, the 20th anniversary document, I think, of benchmarking work in Europe. Now, just a word on this crisis. I think the nature of this crisis is quite different from previous crises. We have first a very strong impact on the supply side because we had the lockdowns. We have a strong impact on the demand side, partly also because of the lockdowns. And we had not this asymmetric crisis we had in the previous crisis. We had finally a crisis in all, practically in all member states, though the consequences of the crisis were quite asymmetric because as it was shown also by the figures, member states had not the same capacities to resist and to respond to this crisis. But there is one important element, which is that the awareness that we could only resist and recover together. This was not the case in the previous crisis. And here I think in that sense, one can say this time it is different. the policies which were really adopted very swiftly, very rapidly, or relatively rapidly, are quite different. First, I would say the decision to use the general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact. This was done very rapidly because everybody was aware that this Stability and Growth Pact could not just did not fit to the present situation, and that we had to take extraordinary measures. The second one was the flexible application of state aid, because you know that competition is a very important policy element, but had we not changed the application of the state aid, well, a lot of companies would have gone bankrupt. So I think this was also quite an important change in European policy. The third one is that we gave member states much more flexibility to use the structural and cohesion funds. So they could use the remaining money to support the jobs, but also to support short-time jobs and to invest in their health systems. So flexibility on the use of resources. Finally, we put into place quite rapidly an instrument which is called SURE, 100 billion euros. That was before the Recovery and Resilience Facility to support follow schemes. And this created a real incentive for all the member states to introduce short-time work schemes. That was not the case in any crisis before. So the idea, we have to preserve jobs because of the nature of this crisis. We have to help companies, but we also have to preserve jobs. And this was facilitated by this instrument, SURE. 19 member states used this instrument. Finally, Next Generation EU, with a recovery and resilience facility of 750 billion, partly grants and half loans. Now we are starting, hopefully very rapidly, this investment facility to really foster the recovery. Because what we need now is targeted investments, support the economy, and this should be done in a rapid way, but at the same time also enhance the changes we need, the green changes, the green transformations, modernizing our production, and also having a strong social dimension. We insist a lot, and it was said, we have to integrate the social pillar in the way how we implement our different policies. So the social has to be part of that, not just something aside, not very important. It has to be in as an important part of this policy. I've forgotten the measures we decided very rapidly for the young, because we all noticed that the young people are the first victims of this crisis. They lost their jobs. They were on the precarious jobs. They were on the short-time contracts, and youth unemployment has gone far higher than overall employment. But so all these measures show this time it is different, and it has to stay different. So also for the future steps, and we certainly will talk about that, they have to be different from the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas Schmidt. You've mapped a whole range of new ideas and differences. My next question goes to Agnes Jongerius. Are you convinced? Will these differences that Nicolas Schmidt has outlined, will that be enough to get us out of the crisis without having the brunt of the crisis borne by the most vulnerable groups? Or how would you do it differently?
Oh dear. How to unmute?
We hear you. We're good.
Yeah, you can. Okay.
We hear you. Yep.
Thank you. I thought when you asked this question, Woos said optimism is a moral duty. This is for me important to say, but it's important also to see that at first, the rhetoric was, we are all in this crisis together. The virus don't discriminate. Well, indeed, as also your data show, the COVID-19 pandemic doesn't affect everybody equally. So indeed, if you have a 0 hours contract, you will be the first out of a job. If you are a frontline worker, you don't have the option to work from home, and therefore you and your relatives are more exposed. And missing classes is for some kids much more hurtful than for others. So the cynical thing of this crisis is, although we say we are in this crisis, we need to fight COVID together. The most vulnerable are carrying the highest burden already. And therefore, indeed, much more is needed now. But like I said, I am optimistic, and I think I can also say why. I think indeed a new wind is blowing in Europe. Let's say that after the Brexit referendum, European leaders started to understand that they need to invest in certainty and in progress for people, not only for some, but for all in Europe. And ever since the Gothenburg summit, I have this little booklet. This one is the Dutch version, always in my bag, because the European Pillar of Social Rights is a answer, although not enough. So indeed, I think it's now high time to learn the lessons from Brexit, from the European Pillar, from the uneven distribution of the consequences of this crisis for people all over Europe. So indeed, a proposal, Nicolas didn't mention it, so this gives me the opportunity to mention it. But I think indeed, higher minimum wages without deductions is important. To get rid of 0 hours contracts is important. To have a resilient social security system is important. And to have affordable social housing is important too, because we cannot afford to make the same mistakes as we did after the banking crisis. Much more people are convinced of that. Luckily, and of course that needs investment, and this needs the hard work of trade unions pushing policymakers and us listening closely to the demands at the table. Next week, we're going to vote on a report in the European Parliament of Dennis Radke and myself on a more concrete follow-up of the European Pillar of Social Rights. It got a broad support in the Employment Committee, so now let's see how the plenary is going to react. And if I can just then add with one sentence, if you have in the family listening in at the moment, good contacts with your MEPs of different member states, please contact them. Votes on the 16th of December, and I hope we can enjoy a good outcome of that report as a step for learning the lessons and to, in a way, not only dream optimistic dreams, but also make this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll certainly pick up on some of those topics later on. Your report that you had prepared together with Dennis Radke, we'll come back to that. Agnes Jongerius, I understood that you needed to leave a bit early. So just in case you do need to leave, before I can come back to you, I'd like to thank you on behalf of ETUI and RGB for having joined this panel. But please stay as long as you can. And if you have something urgent to say, make yourself known and I'll pull you back in. So Dennis Radke, let's go across the aisle, so to speak. You're a friend of the trade unions, clearly. What do you think would need to be different in this recovery? Are you convinced by what you've heard so far?
Ja, hallo zusammen. Also bevor ich zu der konkreten Frage komme, gestattet mir ein paar wenige Bemerkungen. Das Erste, was ich tun will, ich möchte erstmal unserem Freund und Kollegen Nicola Schmidt ganz herzlich zu seinem heutigen Geburtstag gratulieren. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass du an deinem heutigen Ehrentage dir trotzdem Zeit nimmst, um mit Kolleginnen und Kollegen über das Thema soziale Europa zu diskutieren. Das finde ich große Klasse. Zeigt einfach auch, dass du ein echter Gewinn bist für diese Kommission. Und auch wenn uns das Parteibuch unterscheidet, ich glaube, wir spielen beide auf dasselbe Tor. So, das ist das eine. Und zum anderen möchte ich mich ganz herzlich bedanken bei ETUI und auch bei den österreichischen Freunden. Bin ein bisschen erstaunt. Die Österreicher hosten die Veranstaltung und ich bin jetzt der Erste, der Deutsch spricht. Weiß auch nicht so genau, woran das jetzt liegt, aber der Austausch mit dem ÖGB und mit den österreichischen Freunden, ja, ist mir auch wichtig, ist mir immer eine Herzensangelegenheit. Das ist ja zwischen großen und kleinen Geschwistern manchmal nicht so einfach, aber ich habe eigentlich den Eindruck, bei den österreichischen Kollegen klappt es vielleicht ganz gut, weil die sich freuen, dass in Deutschland die Schwarzen noch schwarz sind und nicht türkis. Vielleicht klappt es deswegen zwischen uns so gut. Und jetzt zu deiner konkreten Frage. Bin ich zufrieden? Bin ich überzeugt? Ich finde, das, was wir auf jeden Fall jetzt in der Krise bisher auf den Tisch gelegt haben und wo sich ja jetzt auch in dieser Woche entscheiden wird, schlagen wir den Knoten jetzt endlich durch beim Thema Recovery, ja oder nein? Man ist ja nah dran. Ich finde, das, was man da auf den Tisch gelegt hat, kann man mit Fug und Recht als historisch bezeichnen. Ich glaube, manchmal läuft man ja Gefahr, dass der Begriff historisch ein bisschen inflationär behandelt wird. Aber insgesamt muss man sagen, wenn mich einer vor einem Jahr gefragt hätte, kannst du dir vorstellen, dass die EU als Reaktion auf eine Wirtschaftskrise hergeht, ein 750 Milliarden Paket auflegt, teilweise mit geschenktem Geld, so würde ich es mal bezeichnen, teilweise durch Schulden finanziert, den Weg frei macht für Eigenmittel der Europäischen Union, hätte ich gesagt, ja, kann ich mir vorstellen, vielleicht in 5 bis 10 Jahren. Ich hätte niemals gedacht, dass das so kurzfristig innerhalb von einem Jahr möglich sein wird. Und man sieht ja auch, der Bedarf ist groß. Jugendarbeitslosigkeit, leider Gottes, entwickelt sich wieder in die völlig falsche Richtung. So, da waren wir eigentlich auf einem guten Weg. Da geht es jetzt wieder in die falsche Richtung. Und man sieht, wir haben aus der letzten Krise gelernt, weil es standen ja auch sehr kurzfristig ESM-Mittel zur Verfügung. Aber das Thema ESM ist bei vielen Mitgliedstaaten, die sind da gebranntes Kind, weil sie denken, wenn wir das Geld nehmen, kommt sofort die Troika ums Eck und dann führen wir wieder ganz andere Diskussionen. Von daher glaube ich schon, dass wir uns da insgesamt wirklich auf den richtigen Weg gemacht haben, um eine gemeinsame Antwort auf die Krise zu finden. Und letzte Bemerkung, mir ist eins wichtig. Wir müssen das ja auch als Gesamtpaket sehen. Das eine ist das Thema Recovery, aber wir diskutieren ja auch über Green Deal und Just Transition. Und für mich ist auch als Gewerkschafter eins ganz, ganz wichtig. Wir dürfen nicht nur ehrgeizige Ziele bei der Reduktion von CO2 benennen, sondern wir müssen auch klar sagen, wie wollen wir den Transformationsprozess in der europäischen Industrie so unterstützen, auch finanziell unterstützen, dass es nicht zu Strukturbrüchen führt. Ich komme aus einer Region, die industriell geprägt ist. Wir haben noch sehr, sehr viel Stahlindustrie und die Menschen, die Kolleginnen und Kollegen, die dort arbeiten, haben schlicht und ergreifend Angst vor diesen Entwicklungen. Und deswegen war auch Agnes Jongerius und mir so wichtig, dass wir auch zu diesem Themenkomplex, auch zu dem, was Nicolas noch im nächsten Jahr vor der Brust hat mit der Umsetzung sozialer Säule, dass wir da als Parlament ein starkes Signal setzen und sagen, wo sind unsere Vorstellungen für einen gerechten Transformationsprozess, welchen Beitrag kann und soll und muss die EU leisten, um hier die Menschen auch zu schützen. Ja, so viel von mir einfach mal zum Einstieg.
Thank you very much, Dennis Radke. And of course, thank you for reminding us that it's Nicola Schmidt's birthday. I think on behalf of the nearly 200 people listening in, we'll join you and are especially grateful that you joined us here today. So we've heard a lot about new ideas and new ways to move forward to get out of this crisis. I'd like to ask Ana Catarina Mendoza Mendez in Portugal. You have the huge responsibility now coming up in the next half year from January to move these things forward. Give us a bit of a preview. What do you think the Portuguese presidency will focus on? Will they be, where might they put the priorities in terms of implementing a number of the very good ideas that we've heard here so far?
Sorry. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate on this forum, and I hope it will be well for you, because Portugal holds the presidency of the Council of European Union next January, which will bring to our country once again the opportunity to mark the European social agenda in this very crucial phase of our collective life. This was also the case in the last two Portuguese presidencies, with the Lisbon strategy and the strengthening of the European social model. So in this context, with a very atypical year, 2020, the economic perspectives we had changed completely, and we had to adapt to this new reality, and that includes the balance between employer and employee, and the need to further guarantee protection to the labor relationships, where often one side dominates over the other. So in this context, the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights is of particular importance, especially in what concerns employment, the future of work and of decent work, but also equality and social rights. It also has a key role in the European recovery and in the adaptation to climate and digital transitions while facing the demographic challenges. So this will also be an opportunity to strengthen the dialogue with social partners and its citizens. So social rights are fundamental human rights in all circumstances, and in a pandemic context, even more so. That's why we must strengthen and deepen the policies in this defense. We must ensure that all citizens have access to the right to decent work, and we must guarantee and adequate social protection to those that lose their jobs, as Nicholas said, especially young people. And we must protect labor relations. Committed to the resilience of Europe's economies and to the future of work and of decent work, it is essential to ensure that regulation of telework, the organization of working time, the life and work balance, the right to disconnect, as well as to ensure the access to social protection based on social dialogue and collective bargaining. We know that the world that will come out of this pandemic will be a different one, and we must ensure that the balance between the parts, the employee and the employer, remains fair. We must ensure the right to disconnect, life-work balance, as well the rights of the unemployed. Remote working or teleworking is one clear example of the change we have already seen in the labor market since the beginning of the pandemic. Surely, teleworking will be a major point to discuss, and we are ready to take the first steps in this matter towards the European-wide legal agenda that can conciliate the advantages of telework as for companies and workers, while also protecting the rights of the workforce. As a more generalized teleworking emerges, labor rights must also evolve and be strengthened. Telework may lead companies to force flexibility on schedules, and the pressure on utilities may also rise to each worker's home, while being reduced at the company's office. On the other hand, mental health may also be a concern on the future, as telework will keep the worker home for most of the day. This pandemic, this pandemic has put us all in the test in the face of uncertainty. The fear about the future thickens in the face of the unknown, and it is increasingly more essential to protect the most vulnerable and to fight against social exclusion and inequality. In the post-pandemic context, the world will be different and also the job market will change. Our collective ambition, and in Portugal also with the presidency, must be to ensure that no one is excluded through the challenges of that digital transition, climate transition, to strengthen social protection and to guarantee that qualification means access to the labor market with rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna Katarina. You helped to sort of pull in a number of the issues that previous speakers had brought in. That was very, very helpful. I think it's important to now take a stop and take another look into the benchmarking publication. And I'd like to invite my colleague Soteria Theodopoulou to speak. She's going to give us just a brief 5-minute introduction or deeper look into the macro level impacts and challenges that the speakers until now have been mentioning, looking at the differences between this and the previous recession in terms of its impact, and also looking into some of the national and EU policy responses. So Soteria, if you can help us deepen our understanding of what benchmarking says about where we actually are compared to the past recessions, then you have the floor. Thank you. I'm afraid we can't hear you. Soteria? Speak? No? No, still can't hear you. Then I suggest, Romek, are you ready to go? Can we just switch the sequence? Romek, are you here? There he is.
I'm there.
You're there. Romek, your microphone works. So can I ask you to give your presentation now? Slight change in plans while we figure out what's with Soteria's microphone. And Romek, I would ask you to give us a brief input into the benchmarking, some of the highlights that you wanted to point out to us as co-editor. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the floor. Yes, the publication is so vast that it is difficult to make a insightful or a deep, detailed presentation about it. Therefore, only some highlights of someone who's worked with the publication in and out. I would like to offer 4 messages in the short time that I have at my disposal. First of all, I would like to start from the end of the publication, if you allow, with the foresight analysis that we do. In this foresight analysis, we argue that we do not have to be passive onlookers and bystanders, but that we have some limited control over our future if we follow structured foresight. No one is well prepared for a crisis that they do not anticipate, and this pandemic was perfectly predictable and was also predicted by several experts. In our foresight analysis, we look at the societal challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. We look into the technological challenges, and we are asking the question, is technology going to be the liberator of humanity, or whether it will actually contribute to the demise of the world as we know it? We're also looking into environmental challenges and asking the question whether the greening the transition, whether the transition is going to be greened or whether it is going actually to be business as usual and saving the old obsolete industries. And with this foresight analysis, we are we've identified some possible transformations in the EU. One area is employment, where we are pointing towards uncertainties linked with the unemployment, with telework, with platform economy and the new world of work. And we offer some hypotheses or scenarios, if you will, on how these areas can develop and what sort of control do we have over them. And the final argument here is that a lack of foresight strategy leads to chaotic responses, but a structured foresight can contribute to more structured responses and can allow us not to waste this crisis to learn from and to reshape our reality, the world that we live in. If you allow me to go on, we're also looking on the sustainability questions in the post-COVID world, and we're asking the question whether we are actually on a path to zero carbon economy. And there are some good, there have been some good developments that we've identified. 2030 was identified in many Western economies member states as the target date for a coal phase out in Europe. Some countries are still in black, they still don't have a phase out date. In 2020, solar and wind power are the cheapest sources of energy available. This is a fantastic news. And despite the COVID-19 crisis, we still managed to maintain 50% growth in clean energy investments in the EU in the first half of the 2020. But there are some clouds over the horizon too. We are still witnessing energy poverty levels that are elevated in some member states more than in the others, despite a progression over the past 15 years where the situation has improved, but there are still issues in some southern Mediterranean countries especially. And what we're pointing towards in the analysis is that there is a risk of new investments in renewable energy falling in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis and post-crisis policies. We cannot afford that. Climate cannot sustain any shutdown or quarantine. It's happening now. We need to act and cannot really cut any slack here. What's been already mentioned, and this is my third message, are inequalities. Inequalities have been high before the COVID-19 crisis, and they were amplified by the crisis. Before the crisis in 2019, you can see that in the countries marked in purple, we've witnessed increase of at risk of poverty rates. We have also seen in 2019 still very wide in some countries gaps in gender employment. And that has also been said already, we've seen different capacity and different levels of member states' responses to COVID-19 situation, different expenditure levels on social protection benefits. This all results in inequalities being amplified. We observe rising levels of inequality and precariousness experienced by a growing number of workers in the EU. We see the share of working poor increasing, especially in the most vulnerable countries and groups. Gender equality or inequality is still a problem, with female underrepresentation in corporate positions of power being high before the crisis and amplified by the COVID-19 risk. We see horizontal and vertical labor market segregation that put women at higher risks of physical and mental disorders, sickness, and exposure to stress and COVID in general. We observe inequalities in the COVID-19 crisis linked to low-income workers bearing the brunt of the pandemic, increased inequalities in employment and working conditions. And here, telework was already mentioned, but it really requires to be re-emphasized. Telework is a very good indicator of societal inequalities, being a very luxurious possibility for some, but totally inaccessible to other categories of workers. Because of the awareness of inequalities in Europe, we also point to the fact that the just transition needs to be, the just transition in climate policy needs to be the norm. We cannot allow the transition to climate goals resulting in green inequalities or in exacerbating the existing inequalities. We point to the fact that statutory minimum wages are an efficient tool in fighting low pay, in-work poverty, and wage inequality. And we're also pointing to structural inequalities between regions and countries, with infrastructure, telecom networks, and access to internet being the differentials. And here, even in those structural inequalities, we see that the richer strata of society were able to deal with the crisis in a much better, lighter way, because they were able, for instance, to get out of the cities in lockdown, because they had second homes, they had family in nice locations, they had friends that were living outside of cities, or even they had gardens and could go out to the garden, while the others were needed to stay confined in their apartments. So we need to avoid deepening of inequalities at any price to avoid the risk of social polarization. And let me finish off by one final message. Oliver Rübke already mentioned democracy at work. Democracy at work contributes to better democracy and better participation of people in the parliamentary democracy. And this is such a resource, such an important resource, but yet still we see the European Participation Index in the EU sliding down, decreasing, which means that the workers' voice in company is getting more and more difficult and less present. The pandemic has also put health and safety protection in the spotlight, with companies where worker representation is available having better risk assessment and better prevention policies. And one final message that is really very strong. While quarantine was imposed on companies in COVID-19 and in restructuring, we cannot accept the quarantine being applied to fundamental workers' rights to information, consultation, and participation. And workers' participation must be not only perceived, but used as a resource in exiting the crisis, and not be perceived as an obstacle. Thank you very much. I will leave the floor with that.
Thank you very much, Romek, especially for jumping in so flexibly. I'd like to pick up on two of the themes that you raised. I think the one is occupational health and safety, and the other is the challenge of greening and socially responsible and ecologically sustainable recovery. And for that, I'd like to go to Dennis Radke. Dennis, you and Agnes Jongerius were both rapporteurs for a report on a strong social Europe for just transition. So you really tried to square that circle, as it were. And this is a report that was clearly written in the middle of the pandemic, published just a few weeks ago. Can you tell us how you think that we can find a way out of this crisis that is both socially responsible and ecologically sustainable?
Ja, vielen Dank. Also ich habe ja vorhin das Thema auch schon mal kurz angesprochen und bin kurz auf den Report eingegangen. Ich glaube, und ich meine, das ist natürlich auch in meiner politischen Familie immer ein heiß diskutierter Punkt. Ich glaube, wir können aus der letzten Krise lernen. Wir tun das auch gerade, ohne aber jetzt den Bogen auch total zu überspannen. Also ich glaube, es ist wichtig, dass wir auch das Geld aus dem Recovery Fund nicht dafür benutzen, dass vielleicht der ein oder andere seine Wahlversprechen mit Blick auf Rentenreform oder so damit finanziert. Aber ich glaube, es gibt eben einen Unterschied zwischen Wahlversprechen, populistischen Wahlversprechen auf der einen Seite und auf der anderen Seite dafür zu sorgen und sicherzustellen, dass es nicht wieder zu sozialen Verwerfungen kommt. Wir haben ja in manchen Ländern in der Wirtschafts- und Finanzkrise gesehen, dass die gesamte Tariflandschaft im Grunde genommen zerstört worden ist, mit Problemen, die wir heute noch sehen, mit allen Auswirkungen auf Sozialpartnerschaft. Und diese Dinge dürfen sich eben nicht wiederholen. Und ich glaube, und das sage ich ja auch als jemand, der selber in seinem Leben schon viele Tarifverträge verhandelt hat, die Stärkung der Sozialpartnerschaft ist für die Frage, wie kommen wir aus der Krise raus, wie gestalten wir auch industriellen Wandel ohne Strukturbrüche, eine ganz zentrale Aufgabe. Und was mich immer stört, auch mit Blick auf mein eigenes Heimatland, wir reden in Sonntagsreden sehr viel über soziale Marktwirtschaft, über die Bedeutung von Sozialpartnerschaften. Aber dann, wenn es konkret wird, heißt es, Politik soll sich nicht einmischen, darf sie nicht einmischen. Politik soll sich und muss sich raushalten, da wo es funktioniert. Da wo wir aber immer mehr Unternehmen haben, die sagen, ich bin gar nicht mehr bereit, mich mit der Gewerkschaft an den Tisch zu setzen. Ich werde einen Tarifvertrag nicht unterschreiben, ich werde keinen verhandeln. Da kann Politik auch nicht einfach nur tatenlos zusehen, weil ich sage immer, Freiheit ist wichtig in der sozialen Marktwirtschaft, aber Freiheit und Verantwortung gehören zusammen in der sozialen Marktwirtschaft. Und deswegen spielt auch in dem Bericht von Agnes und mir die Frage Tarifbindung, wenn es um Mindestlohn geht, genau wie im Kommissionsvorschlag, die ganz zentrale Rolle, weil ich nach wie vor der Meinung bin, faire Löhne, gerechte Löhne macht nicht die Politik, sondern faire Löhne und gerechte Löhne gibt es am Ende nur durch einen Tarifvertrag. Und will vielleicht noch abschließend einen Punkt sagen, weil Nicolas vorhin in seinen Ausführungen auch auf das Funktionieren von Schur hingewiesen hat. Ich glaube, allen Unkenrufen zum Trotz ist es wirklich ein hervorragendes Instrument. Und wir müssen uns wirklich gut überlegen, wie wir in Zukunft mit diesem Instrument umgehen. Es ist ja zeitlich befristet. Es gibt ja immer wieder auch die Idee einer Arbeitslosenrückversicherung, die ich eher skeptisch sehe. Aber vielleicht müssen wir wirklich mal darüber nachdenken, lasst uns das doch mit der Arbeitslosenrückversicherung lieber sein lassen. Und lasst uns doch mal überlegen, macht es nicht Sinn, Schur einfach auszuweiten nach einem klaren Kriterienkatalog, nicht als Ersatz für staatliche Leistung, sondern als Unterstützung. Weil ich glaube, es wäre ein wichtiges Signal der Europäischen Union, dass wir sagen, wir wollen Beschäftigung halten, wir wollen Beschäftigung unterstützen und nicht Arbeitslosigkeit finanzieren.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I think after we've heard the presentation of my colleague Soteria Teotoropoulou about the SURE minimum wage, I think we can come back to that very important point that you made. But I'd like to stay with the idea of having a social responsible and ecologically sustainable recovery. And I'd like to ask Luca Vicentini, from the point of view of the ETUC, how is it possible to square the circle? Are you convinced that the recovery and the Green Deal can work in tandem? Luca's muted.
A sign if it's okay. Okay,
Yes.
great. Because we have, as you have seen, some echo problems. So I hope by switching off your audio, so I cannot listen to you now. But I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Aline, for this question. Sustainability of the recovery is really the essential point on which we have to reflect. And from our point of view as the ETUC, there are three conditions to make the recovery sustainable. The first condition is not to create now massive unemployment. Because if we turn the more than 40 million workers that are at the moment suspended from work and supported by the different Kurzarbeit, Cassa Integrazione in Italy, any other kind of income compensation or employment support measures, they are kept with their jobs still available for them to come back to when the crisis will be finished. If all these people lose this support, now that we are in the middle of the second wave of the pandemic, then the risk is that the beginning of next year to have tens of millions of workers moving from suspension from work to unemployment. And then any kind of sustainable recovery will be possible. There will be a disaster in terms of unemployment and social crisis in Europe. That's why we are insisting so much in this very moment, and Nicolas knows this very well. By the way, happy birthday, Nicolas. I didn't know about that. It's a great news. I hope we will be able to celebrate very soon in person, not being obliged only to see each other through a video. But Nicolas knows very well how much we are stressing this point, that we need an immediate prolongation of the emergency measures in support of employment, at least until the next semester. Because, colleagues, we know perfectly that whatever will be, whenever an agreement will be reached with Poland and Hungary in particular, that are vetoing, as you know, I mean, the European budget and the recovery plan, etc. Even if an agreement is reached tomorrow, it will take at least 6 months for the different national parliaments to approve the plan, and then for the European Union to issue the bonds and then raise the money, etc., etc. I don't want to make the story long, but at least 6 months for the money of the recovery plan to be disbursed. In the meantime, if there is not a prolongation of the emergency measures, we will have 40 million people unemployed. And this is a risk we need absolutely to avoid, as we have also to make sure that everybody, also non-standard workers, self-employed, precarious people, are covered by these emergency measures, which is not the case now in most of the European member states. We have millions of people that are that went simply and directly into poverty because they lost most of their income. So first emergency is to make sure that people are protected. Then the second point is, of course, what will be the content of this recovery strategy? And there are here a couple of elements that are worth mentioning. The first one is the macroeconomic sustainability of this recovery strategy. Because Nicholas was right at the beginning when he said that the European Union was able, and even the member states, even the frugals, so-called frugals, were able to take the responsibility to say, okay, this time we cannot address, this new crisis with the old recipes. We cannot put again in place austerity measures, budgetary restraints, etc., etc. They came over with a very ambitious strategy for recovery, with a lot of money for investment, etc. But it's clear that if in 6 months' time, again, we will have austerity, macroeconomic conditionalities, and there will be not a radical revision of the European economic governance, all these good intentions will end into nothing. So it's very important to keep track on the changes in the European economic governance. And then the other fundamental element is to make this recovery sustainable in terms of greening the economy, making it more digital, absolutely important, but at the same time, by keeping the social dimension and the job creation dimension at the core of the digital and green transition. This is for us just transition. Just transition means that nobody's left behind, and it's not enough to offer young people or steel workers or miners simply some training courses. Skills are important. I'm not going to deny this, but if you don't offer a job, a quality job to the people that are at risk of losing their jobs, skills are not going to fix the problem. This means a lot of investment, a lot of active labor market policies, but it means also social dialogue, economic governance in the local communities, the capacity of avoiding to create other economic and social deserts in the reality and communities where you are going to dismiss some economic activities. You need to replace these activities with other activities that should be more sustainable also in social terms. So you need to create a great number of quality jobs to compensate. We cannot simply tell people, okay, you are going to lose your job and you will be a pre-pensioner, or you will have a lot of skills improved in a way that you will find another job maybe 1,000 kilometers from the place where you had your jobs before. So this is not possible. This is not an offer for a better future. That's why we insist so much on sustainability in macroeconomic terms and sustainability in social and employment terms. And of course, also the other elements that Romuald and the others have mentioned, workers' participation, collective bargaining, social dialogue, fairness in the labor market, all these elements have to be fundamentally taken into account and embedded in the recovery strategy of the European Union. On this, I would like to say a very last thing, is that the initiatives that the European Commission is pushing forward, the action plan for the European Pillar of Social Rights, the directive on minimum wages, but also other initiatives announced on minimum income, on platform work, on health and safety, on carcinogens, on due diligence, workers' participation, all these elements, all this new corpus of legislative initiatives must be delivered. It has to be delivered. Unfortunately, during the COVID, it was very difficult for the Croatian and the German presidency to deliver because the circumstances were very difficult. But we give a great hope in the Portuguese presidency now towards the big social summit in Porto at the beginning of May to make sure that all these great initiatives can become really reality, to accompany as a straitjacket, if you want, some kind of good orientation and guidance, what should be then the sustainable recovery we were talking about. These are the great challenges. It's up to us to make them real. Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you very much, Luca. I'd like to give the floor. I want to ask Anna Katarina. We've heard a lot, particularly now from Luca Vicentini. We need to move forward. There is a new wind blowing, and there's so much to do. How do you see the Portuguese presidency addressing these twin challenges of having a recovery without losing sight of the European Green Deal?
Sorry.
Okay. Very good.
You hear me? Sorry. Well, it's tough. I will try to be brief, but I believe that the pandemic has changed the way people look at the environmental consequences of the economic activity. And I'm not utopic. I'm not anymore 20 years. And surely things will not change overnight, and problems were not simply solved by the temporary reduction of economic activity. I think we all remember seeing images of the pollution over Wuhan and other Chinese cities in 2019 and in this February. But pollution fell dramatically, and that also happened here in Europe. Of course, we cannot just give up on production, stop factories, and send workers home to solve the environmental issues we are facing. But with a more serious approach to the problem, as I don't know the name, as Luca said already. So, but with a more serious approach to the problem, paired with the harsh reality that each day of inaction is one too many days. And I'm an optimistic, and I'm positive that we can take to the table a strong response, usually known as the European Green Deal. And if we look to the Paris Agreement, we may be optimistic about the commitment countries have to take the climate changes. But even the Paris Agreement may not be enough, and we cannot keep waiting for countries that are rather willing to be free riders of initiatives, or countries that just want us to fail. So we must take the lead. And I take the chance to acknowledge the breath of fresh air, the return of the United States to the Paris Agreement. So Biden give us a hope also to fight together in Europe and in the world to have this challenge, to a commitment, a more commitment of this challenge. So let me stress this once more. On economic recovery and no social resilience will last if it does not come hand in hand with answers to the climate crisis. That is why we will move here in Portugal and with the European presidency forward and conclude, hopefully, the negotiations for a European climate law during the first 6 months of 2021, with the goal of making Europe carbon neutral by 2050 in the framework of the European Climate Pact. This pact is central for both the social and economic recovery and resilience of the member states. And it is the European response to the climate challenges, those that will continue to rise in the future if no step is taken. Portugal, I'm sure, with this government, will contribute to the tackling of these challenges through various events such as a summit on hydrogen and one on green mining, bearing in mind the importance of batteries problem. So a few notes for these presidencies as an optimistic Green Deal pact.
Absolutely. No, that definitely sounds promising. And I wish you and your colleagues and your government much luck in moving it forward. But the ideas are certainly there, as we've heard. Nicola Schmidt, I'm sure you'd have a lot to say about the Green New Deal and the recovery, but we've already heard a lot. What I want to hear from you now is to just briefly turn our attention to occupational health and safety. We know that the COVID crisis was a public health crisis, but it was also a crisis for occupational health and safety. And the pandemic has certainly shown a very harsh light on the existing rules and the adherence to those rules. And we've seen lots of deficiencies, and it's outlined in the benchmarking of regulatory failures, inadequate implementation of legislation, disparities in worker protection, and a really troubling lack of data. I see we have a young participant here. Hello, small Radke person. So Nicolas Schmidt, can you tell us where would the Commission even begin in order to address these multiple deficiencies that we've seen in occupational health and safety during the pandemic?
Well, first, I would say we will continue our work. We had reacted immediately on the classification of the virus, even if we did not agree totally on the classification, but there was a very rapid reaction. We are now working on the change of the directive on carcinogens and other substances. We will adopt a new strategic framework on health and safety next year. So we are aware also that there are new issues there, new problems. We have to look also at the new forms of work and the risks for health and security, especially for health, including also remote work. We have an explosion of situations like burnouts, stress due to bad working conditions. We have to talk about the right to disconnect. All these are very important issues we will address. Because we need in a very modern, innovative, and competitive economy. This cannot go with situations where the health and safety of workers are not protected, because this is not in the interest, obviously, of the workers, but it's not in the interest of the companies either. So what the non-respect of regulations and is concerned, well, I think we have to work closer with member states that they really take this more serious, that there are more controls, that there is more responsibility, which was mentioned also of companies, that there are also sanctions if standards and regulations are not respected. So there's a role for member states, there's a role for inspectors, for inspections, there's a role for social partners, by the way, in some countries where social partners have this responsibility mainly. So I think we will continue very actively on this health and safety issues.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicolas Schmidt. I can only hope, and from the sounds of it, that we have learned some important lessons from the pandemic. And as we know, and I think all the fields that we work in, having the legislation isn't always enough. We need to work hard on enforcement and on the transparency surrounding that. So thank you, everyone, for that round. I'd like to now go back to Soteria Theodoropoulos' presentation. So we're now going to go back up and to the more macro level and look again at differences in the different policy instruments that were available. Just so you know, I'm planning on going about 15 minutes overtime because we started a bit late with this panel section. Just so you know, I would aim to finish at 5:45 at the latest. So Soteria, you have the floor. I hope we can hear you now.
Can you?
Excellent, yes.
Okay, great. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for having joined the launch of the Benchmarking Working Europe 2020. In the next 5 minutes, I will try to go over some of the economic challenges and policies that the pandemic, some of the challenges that the pandemic poses for the economies and economic policies in Europe. My I have three key messages. First, that this recession is likely to be more costly in terms of job than the previous one and be followed by a long-drawn recovery. My second message is that differences in resilience, economic specialization, and fiscal space, how much different member states can use their fiscal policies, risk setting off divergence processes in living standards among the member states. And my third message is that policy responses so far seem to have deviated from ideas informing economic policy making in Europe and the advanced world in the last 40 years. The question is, will they last? Is this time going to be different, as we heard earlier? So by means of closing perhaps the interventions from the benchmarking team, I will be going through the open issues to be watching in the next few years in this respect. As Commissioner Schmidt mentioned earlier, this has been a shock that has affected all member states in the EU. But as we see from this graph here, which shows the change in real GDP in the first and the second quarter of 2020 by comparison to the previous, to the respective quarters in 2019, we see that in the second quarter in particular, when the measures of governments to stem the spread of the pandemic took really force, we see that we had a very, we had a reduction in real GDP across all EU member states, but it ranged from 21.5% in Spain and the United Kingdom on a year-to-year basis for the second quarter to only 3.7 and 4.6% in Ireland and Lithuania. So we see that the same shock seemed to have had very different consequences in terms of real GDP growth. Now, turning more specifically to my first message and why I think that this is going to be, this is likely to be a recession that's going to cost a lot of jobs, what we see here is the change in real gross value added by sectors. So we see that the purple dots show you what happened again in the second quarter of 2020 by comparison to the second quarter of 2019. And we see that by far the most impacted sectors are the arts and entertainment and recreation, the wholesale and resale trade, transport, accommodation, and foods service activities. All these are services sectors which tend to be in general very labor intensive. They also tend to have large concentrations of groups that are usually more fragile, more vulnerable in the labor force, younger people, women, and we often see more temporary contracts there than in sectors like industry, which has not been unaffected, but you know, in comparison to the previous crisis, industry construction were much more affected than the services. And we see a similar picture here. If we look at the employment losses in the second quarter between 2020 and 2019, we see that accommodation and food, this is actually a finer breakdown of sectors, lost almost 1.5 million jobs, followed by wholesale and retail trade and other services, which includes, it could be travel agencies. There are many heterogeneous sectors there. They almost lost 1 million services each. Manufacturing and mining were not spared, but as I say, there was a greater concentration of the impact in the services sectors. Another reason why you know, this can be problematic is also the fact that demand in these services is not pent up. So if we don't have, for example, the classical example is the haircut. If we don't have a haircut during a lockdown, it's not that we're going to have two haircuts when you know, the crisis is over, which means that the demand that has been lost is going to remain lost, and therefore the recovery can also be more long drawn because of that. Now, moving to my second message, that differences in resilience capacity are risk setting off divergence processes among member states. My colleague Nicola Kontouris mentioned earlier, showed the graph about the very different levels of public debt as a share of GDP in different member states. So we had Greece with 207% of GDP being predicted to reach in 2020, and we had quite a few member states being even below 60%, which means that different member states may have different capacity to spend, to roll out support programs for their economies. Another factor of resilience is how much we spend on social protection benefits, which help us deal with market and social risks. And this figure here shows you the expenditure on social protection benefits by different function as a share of GDP. The data are from 2018, but I think it can show us to some extent the great variety in resilience with which in capacity to deal with shocks that different member states entered the crisis with. So we see that as a total, the total expenditure as a share of GDP ranges from 13.7% in Ireland to 31.5% in France, which is quite a big, it's more than twice as big. And if we look into subcategories there, we can also see that there are differences, for example, in how much member states spend on healthcare as a share of GDP. So, for example, in 2018, we see that France dedicated 9.1% of GDP to sickness healthcare, while Cyprus only 3.4%. And similarly with unemployment, France and Belgium spend 1.9% of their GDP, whereas Hungary and Malta were only down to 0.2 to 0.3%. Now moving on to my third message, the policy responses to this crisis seem to have challenged ideas that had been guiding economic policies for a long time. We have heard a lot about these policies. The speakers spoke before, but so I will quickly go through this. So, for example, the promotion of short-time work and job retention schemes, instead of allowing for employment and wages to adjust, allowing companies, or rather encouraging companies to have the flexibility to shed labor, to fire workers, or alternatively to reduce their wages so that they deal with the shock. This seems to be different this time. In fact, the SURE program seems to be, encouraging even member states who had not experienced with these policies before to establish them, to install them so that they can benefit from the support it provides. We have seen large increases in public spending, and not only seen them, but they have also been welcomed and encouraged by prominent policy voices from international organizations like the OECD, to Mario Draghi, who in an interview in late March suggested that governments should really go as far as they could in rolling out such support programs, so that, and the application of fiscal rules has been suspended in the EU. So we see an increase in public spending and a larger state, effectively, which is not something that has been informing public policies before. The third point is that we have had the agreement on the EU budget and the next generation EU, which, as it seems, will be ratified today or tomorrow. There will be a solution to the recent problems that were in that process, which effectively establish fiscal transfers across member states on the basis of need to support recovery and just transition. So this is a big change compared to the previous crisis, where we did have support coming from member states, but it came with very strict conditions attached, and very painful conditions attached to the member states that received it. And last but not least, we have seen large expansion of asset purchases, including government bonds by the European Central Bank, which has been supporting government borrowing effectively, something which until recently we saw that the German Constitutional Court tried to challenge in March. So the question is, will this last? What should we be watching in the next few years to see whether this wave of Keynesianism is not just due to the fact that we are all in a foxhole now, as Robert Lucas, a famous anti-Keynesian academic economist had said. So what should we be looking, so what should we be watching? Well, the first question is what's going to happen with the EU economic governance and especially the fiscal surveillance framework. The European Commission had started a public consultation process in February of 2020, before the crisis began. This conversation seems to have been put on hold for the moment, but it will be very crucial because, to return to the figure that Nicola Kontouris mentioned earlier about public debt to GDP, if these rules were to stay in the same, in their place, once their application was reinstated, and we would have to see, and once the recession ended, but growth not necessarily returned, we would have to see member states having public debt above 60% of their GDP, having to pursue policies that would reduce that by 1/20th per year. That can be quite a large fiscal contraction, especially if the recovery is not, robust, and especially given the fact that we need to invest in order to foster transition and just transition to a carbon neutral economy and a digital society. The second question will be whether SHU would be expanded and extended. We are already quite close to the 100 billion euros capacity that was planned to be drawn on the guarantees that the member states would provide, and whether eventually it would become a permanent EU unemployment reinsurance scheme. At the moment, it's just for short-time work schemes, but it could be expanded for other purposes as well. The third question would be whether what has been established now as the next generation EU, what will be established as the next generation EU, would become a permanent fiscal capacity for the EU or the Eurozone that would greatly help member states in managing shocks for their economy and avoid the consequences of large recession. Another reform process that has been going, or consideration, has been that the European Central Bank has started a review of its monetary policy strategy to deal with the new conditions that seem to have been prevailing in European economies for quite a while now, with inflation being well below what the target of 2% should have been. And last but not least, how will the principles of the European Pillar of Social Rights be implemented to allow for a convergence in social standards and resilience among member states? And thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Sotiria, you've certainly thrown a lot of really compelling and important questions out that I hope we'll still be able to shed some light on. I understand that Dennis Radke has to leave to his next video conference. So before you go, Dennis, I'd like to hear I have one last question for you. Some of us who were paying attention had the honor of seeing your daughter, I think, climbing around on your lap. So my question to you before you go is, when you read her goodnight story tonight, out of the benchmarking work in Europe, which chapter will you read to her, and what will be your happy end?
Also ich lese ja natürlich meistens andere Geschichten vor, aber also für mich ist der zentrale Punkt, den ich vorhin auch schon mal angesprochen habe, Zukunft der Sozialpartnerschaft und die Frage von Tarifbindung. In meinem Elternhaus ist immer klar gewesen, meine Großväter waren auch 50 Jahre in der IG Metall. Wer arbeiten geht, der muss in eine Gewerkschaft gehen. Mein Vater war selber auch AT-Angestellter und ist aber immer auch Gewerkschaftsmitglied geblieben, weil er immer gesagt hat, solange ich das Unternehmen nicht leite, bin ich genauso Arbeitnehmer wie jeder andere auch. Und deswegen finde ich einfach auch diese Thematik Zukunft der Sozialpartnerschaft elementar. Das würde ich meiner Tochter sagen. Und wenn sie irgendwann mal vor dem Sprung ins Berufsleben steht, wenn sie nicht von selbst drauf kommt, dann werde ich sie in den Arsch treten. dass sie sich organisiert, weil wenn immer weniger sich organisieren, dann bekommen wir nichts durchgesetzt. Und ob es ein Happy End gibt, das entscheiden wir am Ende selbst. Wenn keiner mehr mitmacht, dann muss man auch auf ein Happy End nicht mehr hoffen. Also in diesem Sinne, vielen Dank für den Austausch. Ich hoffe, Nicolas kommt heute noch zum Feiern. Und ansonsten bis bald.
Vielen Dank, Dennis. Thank you very much. So we've anticipated a bit the happy end. Nicolas Schmidt, my question goes to you. There's not much that you can do about organizing, but you do have something to do with the minimum wage. Some have seen the minimum wage directive as a paradigm change in the way that the Commission sees wages and collective bargaining. In that sense, it links directly to what Dennis Radke was saying. Aside from the minimum wage, are there any other initiatives to push for fair wages and strong collective bargaining that the Commission may have in the drawer? Anything else happening?
Well, I think this proposal on the framework of adequate minimum wages is an important contribution and gives also a very strong signal that this time it's different, because it was already mentioned that during the previous crisis in some member states, wages were cut, minimum wages were reduced. There was this theory that wages had to be at least with moderate increases. And when you say moderate increase, that means in general, even if it was added at the same level as productivity, in fact, wages increased less than productivity. So there is an issue for wages in Europe. And one cannot say, well, we have attention, if you increase the wages, we will have an inflation problem, because we have a deflation problem in a certain way. There's the risk for deflation in Europe. So there is no, for the time being, a risk for inflation. So I think wages are extremely important, and given the possibilities we have on the basis of the treaty. So this proposal should also be promote a dynamic on wages. Therefore, perhaps also some social partners are not so happy with it, and they criticize it because they have well understood it's not the minimum wage only, it's wages in general. So this is important. I think we cannot come out of this crisis by wage austerity. We need a new balance also in terms of wages, certainly. It's not me, by the way, there are a lot of economies which are not close to trade unions who say, well, we cannot stay with this wage austerity because this is also part of the imbalances in our economy, and therefore we have to do something about that. So now, are there other issues which are important? Certainly, we have talked about the action plan on social Europe, on the pillar of European pillar of social rights. Well, this is finally a very strong, should be a very strong moment, because this will give us how to build a strong social dimension for the European Union in the next 10 years. And this should also show that we can only recover and rebuild our economies with a strong social dimension. So this is the challenge. Will we be successful? We have the Green Deal. Yes, that's important. A need for a lot of investments. We have the digitalization of many sectors in our society and so on. So we have to make sure that both transformations are fair and just, and are also socially balanced. Because otherwise and that's the point, otherwise we will have a lot of problems in our societies. This crisis has created a lot of turmoil, psychological ones for many people. joblessness. We have talked about the young who are really the victims of this crisis, inequalities, which have to be, this issue has to be tackled. And speaking about inequality, we have even to speak about poverty, because we have an increase in poverty, people who have lost their income. And Luca has spoken about those who have not seen their income more or less maintained. Now, will there be other issues? Yes. There will be an issue on those also who have played a key role in this crisis, who are the platform workers. And these are very often outside all our schemes, our social protection schemes. They have no collective bargaining. They have no, they are told that they are self-employed, but they are not self-employed. So we have to deal with this issue. I'm very happy when I read that now President-elect Biden has chosen as the chair of the economic advisors a lady who is a specialist also on these issues and who has very strongly advocated changes for the platforms in the US. So this is the chair of the economic advisors in the US. She is very much in that. So I think Europe cannot trail behind the US. We have to deal with this issue of the platform workers, of their rights, in labor relations, but also in terms of social protection. So this will be certainly a very important issue. The other issue which we have to deal with is poverty, and especially we will deal with child poverty. But when we deal with child poverty, we have to look also at the families, because poor children belong to poor families. Because we have a growing part in Europe where people are really falling behind and really falling in situations of poverty. And poverty is a terrible thing for our societies, but poverty and inequality, by the way, are bad also for the economy. We are heading for a much more technically advanced economy, requiring more skills and so on. Well, people who are poor, we all know that their children have difficulties at school. They have not the same opportunities. So we have to build some kind of a new social contract. Even on the side of some employers, they are aware of that. Otherwise, our societies will come under heavy stress, and not only our societies, but also our political systems. And that's what we have to deal with starting now, starting with the recovery, starting with the action plan on the social pillar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas Schmidt. Certainly a large panoply of things that we need to do. Anna Catarina, you need to leave. And then we have one more question I'd like to ask Luca Vicentini. But before we go, Anna Catarina, where can you see the minimum wage directive going under the Portuguese presidency? What hopes can we have there?
Well, thank you very much, Ellen, and thank you for the participation once again. Well, the Germany presidency has rightfully set out the project on minimum wage as a key issue, and the Portuguese presidency will continue to move the theme forward. And we know that it is really important, as Nicolas said, we have so many challenges in the labor world, that the minimum wage, we need it really, because we know that the member state salaries vary greatly, and that 10% of the workforce in Europe doesn't have a wage that allows to escape poverty. And in pandemic times, we need really a minimum wage. So we know Portugal, for example, cannot be exempt from this challenge. And the setting of European minimum wage is a debate that will take its time, and that will be the result of concerted efforts of all member states, European member states. So we in Portugal understand the importance of setting minimum wage that entitle the citizens to the right to decent conditions. That's why our government announced yesterday yet another increase in Portuguese minimum wage for 2021. And the government in power has increased the minimum wage more than 30% in the last 6 years. So the National Recovery and Resilience Plans and its success will be keynotes to the accomplishing of the goals of the minimum wage directive, as well as the directive of transparency of pay. So I hope the Portuguese presidency can guarantee that we have this work together to have a minimum wage in Europe. Thank you very much for this participation and for this rich debate, and see you next time. I need to go to the plenary session, sorry.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Anna Katarina. It's been a pleasure. Good luck also next spring. Nicola Schmidt, you also need to leave, but before you go, will you tell us, if you had a group of young people in front of you, which chapter of benchmarking would you tell them that they must read the most attentively?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't read your report yet, so it's a bit difficult, but I think they should read this report. And I have kids at home, so I will try to tell them to have a look at this report, to know a bit more about the realities of our time, the challenges we and they have in face, and also the possibilities we have to change. I agree. If we are not changing the situation, well, the situation will not change and the situation will deteriorate. There are a lot of reasons why it can improve, but there are also a lot of reasons how it can deteriorate. And this brings us to us, but also the young people, to something which I would not like that they would get in the future of our societies. So I would say your report is very valuable, very precious. It's very good to have this discussion. We have to bring in this discussion everywhere and to discuss about the challenges, and especially also about the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for your participation. Happy birthday again, and enjoy your evening. Luca Vicentini, you have the honor to close this round. And there are a whole bunch of questions that I could ask you, but I'm tempted to ask you the good night story question as well, or the variant of that. If you had a group of young people in front of you, which chapter, which part of benchmarking, which topic would you say they need to pay particular attention to?
Well, I don't think it would be a good idea to ask a group of young people in front of me to pick up a piece of the benchmarking. On the contrary, I think we should convince them that through our benchmarking, we can really put in place a policy that will make them feel included in a better world, in a better future. This is the point. And in this respect, I think that we need to use instruments like this benchmarking to show to the young people that the trade unions, first of all, but then also all the other actors that should participate in a policy for the future, that we will be able to offer them a decent job with a decent salary, with decent working conditions, and in a good environment where they can feel safe, themselves, their families, and they can really see they can have a better future. And as Dennis Radke also said, we need also to convince them that it's worth joining a trade union, participating in collective bargaining, in social dialogue, in participation and information and consultation in their workplace, because through all this, they can really improve their working conditions, but also really have a better future for themselves and their families. You know, at the moment, young people are probably the ones that face the worst challenges. It was the case before COVID, but now after COVID, it's even worse. And so we really need to give a hope to young people. In this respect, the trade unions bear a great responsibility. And I think that, as I said at the beginning in the opening, this benchmarking can really be a very useful tool for us to succeed on this.
Thank you very, very much, Luca. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the speakers, Nicola, Soteria, and Romek, for having done the nearly impossible presenting this detailed information. Thank you to the 100 participants that have stuck around until now. To the interpreters, Paul and Edgar, thank you very much for your support to help transmit this to even more people. The benchmarking report is available online and will be coming hot off the press in the coming weeks. So hopefully you'll be able to get your hands on a paper copy as well. So I'd like to close this session. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for your interest, for your participation. I wish everybody a fantastic evening, and everybody stay safe and enjoy the holidays. Thank you very much indeed.